My name is Rebecca, and 22 years ago my father looked me in the eye and said, "You've dishonored this family. Pack your things." Those words still echo in my chest. They were the last thing he spoke before turning his back and walking into the house, leaving me standing on the front steps of our Victorian home, clutching the secret inside me that no one in my family could accept. I was 18, terrified and pregnant, and from that moment on, I was no longer a daughter in his eyes. I was a stranger. That afternoon, I remember the autumn light slanting through the maple trees like a spotlight of judgment. My older sister Jessica stood just inside the front door, her arms crossed, shaking her head like she had predicted this exact moment. "Don't even think about coming back," she whispered harshly. "You made your choice." Mom was upstairs in her bedroom, crying so hard I could hear her through the closed window, but she didn't come down. Maybe she couldn't. Maybe she was too afraid of disappointing him. I felt the weight of silence as I stepped off those brick steps with nothing more than a backpack and the echo of his words following me down the cobblestone walkway. "You have to understand, I grew up in a strict Catholic household in New England where reputation was everything. Dad was a prominent lawyer, the kind of man people called a pillar of the community. He wore his three-piece suits like armor and quoted scripture like it was ammunition. But when it came to me, his youngest daughter, he showed no compassion. To him, I had destroyed his good name. To my sister, I had embarrassed the family legacy. I walked down that tree-lined street, knowing I was stripped of any safety net. It felt like exile from everything I had ever known. The first place I went was a friend's apartment. I remember lying on her lumpy futon all night, one hand on my belly, wondering how I could possibly raise a child on my own. I thought about calling Mom, but every time I reached for the phone, I imagined Dad grabbing it first. I could still hear his voice. "Don't even think about coming back." I didn't want to give him the satisfaction of being right, so I stayed silent. In those early weeks, I learned quickly what survival meant. I worked at a coffee shop during the day, standing on my feet until my back ached, and at night, I cleaned office buildings. My ankles swelled, my hands cracked from cleaning chemicals, but I kept showing up. I rented a tiny studio apartment with water stains on the ceiling. The radiator clanged all night and the heat barely worked in winter, but it was mine. And inside me, my baby kept reminding me why I couldn't give up. Every kick, every flutter told me I wasn't alone. It wasn't just me against the world. It was us. I still remember one moment in particular. It was January, just after New Year's. Snow was falling thick, and I had to walk home from the coffee shop because the old Honda I borrowed from a coworker wouldn't start. I was 7 months along, exhausted, and my coat barely buttoned around my belly. People walked past me, couples with shopping bags, families laughing, but nobody looked twice. I sat down on a park bench and cried harder than I ever had before. That was the lowest point. For a split second, I thought maybe Dad was right, that I had dishonored everything, and misery was all I deserved. But something changed in me that night. A stranger stopped, an elderly woman with kind eyes. She didn't ask me why I was crying. She just sat next to me, handed me a cup of hot chocolate from a nearby cart, and said, "Sweetheart, sometimes God's greatest gifts come wrapped in our deepest pain." That sentence pierced through the fog. I carried it with me from that day on. I realized I had a choice. Either let shame define me or fight to build something better. That's when I started looking for a path forward. I applied for community college classes using grants and student loans. I signed up for ROTC because they offered scholarships and structure. And frankly, I needed both. At first, it was grueling. My body was already worn down from long shifts and pregnancy. But the discipline, the camaraderie, it gave me a purpose. For the first time since those brick steps, I felt like I belonged somewhere again. The day I gave birth alone in that dingy apartment, I thought about calling my parents. I thought maybe hearing their grandchild's cry would soften their hearts. But when I held my baby girl, tiny fingers curled tight around mine, I realized I didn't need their approval anymore. I looked down at her and whispered, "We're going to make it. Just you and me," and I meant it with every fiber of my being. Those first years weren't glamorous. I juggled diapers, midnight feedings, classes, and part-time jobs. There were nights when I collapsed onto the floor, too tired to crawl into bed. But every challenge hardened me, sharpened me. I became someone my father would never recognize. Someone stronger than his rejection, tougher than his words. The girl he threw out was gone. A new woman was being forged in fire. Looking back now, I see part one of my story not as tragedy, but as the beginning of transformation. It was the push that forced me to find my own footing, the cut that made the scar, the exile that made the return so powerful. My father thought he had ended my story that day. In truth, he set in motion a journey that would one day bring him to his knees. I didn't realize how much a routine could save a person until I built one from scratch. Mornings began with a second-hand coffee maker gurgling to life on my counter, the smell of burnt grounds mixing with baby powder and disinfectant. I'd strap my daughter Sophia into a thrift store stroller and push her for blocks to the woman who watched her while I worked the morning shift at the coffee shop. The brass bell over the shop door chimed. The same cheerful note every day. I wiped coffee rings, refilled sugar dispensers for businessmen in expensive coats, and learned how to smile at people who never looked up from their newspapers. Community college was a blur of fluorescent lights and cinder block hallways. I took evening classes, English composition, American history, a public speaking course that terrified me. ROTC met at dawn on Mondays and Wednesdays. I dropped Sophia off before the sun came up, whispering apologies for waking her, then jogged to campus with my backpack bouncing against my spine. PT was a shock to the system. I was still rebuilding my body after childbirth, and for the first few months, I was always at the back of the formation. But there was a stubbornness inside me my father had misjudged. When my lungs burned, I imagined those brick steps on that autumn afternoon and found another step. There were people who changed my life in small ways. The stranger with the hot chocolate had planted a seed. At the coffee shop, a retired Marine sergeant named Frank started leaving me notes with his tips. "Miss," he'd say, because he called every woman Miss, "always keep your gear squared away. Excellence starts with the details." He'd slide a folded napkin with advice. Proper push-up form, interval running, how to tape a blister. "You doing ROTC?" he asked one morning. I nodded. "Outstanding," he said. And that was the whole sermon. Later, when I passed my first fitness test without collapsing, I left a homemade muffin on his table on the house. He tipped me $10 and a smile that lasted all day. Money was a constant worry. I donated plasma twice a month when the electric bill came with that threatening red stamp. I spent a Thursday afternoon at the social services office, Sophia asleep on my chest, listening to a caseworker explain the difference between charity and opportunity. I learned to stretch a rotisserie chicken across 4 dinners and to fix a broken zipper with a paperclip. I learned what true exhaustion felt like, the kind where you read the same paragraph 3 times and still can't remember the words. Church was complicated. Dad's church wasn't my church anymore. But on Sundays, I found a small congregation that met in a converted warehouse between a laundromat and a pizza place. No stained glass, just folding chairs and a pastor with a worn acoustic guitar. They didn't ask questions when I cried during the second hymn. A woman named Margaret's silver hair pinned in a neat bun started bringing over casseroles just because. On the nights I thought about calling my mother, I baked banana bread for Margaret and said thank you to many times. ROTC taught me to hold my head like it belonged to somebody who mattered. The first time I wore the uniform to campus, I stared at myself in a bathroom mirror and saw a person I didn't recognize. Chin level, shoulders back. The instructors were not sentimental. They cared about standards and requirements and whether you showed up 5 minutes early. I started craving that certainty. If you did the work, you earned the rank. Nobody could take that from you. I won't pretend I got it all right. I missed Sophia's first word because I stayed late to practice drill commands in an empty classroom. I forgot to sign a daycare form and lost our spot for 2 weeks. One midnight, walking home with Sophia asleep in her stroller, a police officer slowed beside me. He asked if I was okay. I said I was fine. He didn't believe me. He circled the block twice. I walked faster. When Sophia was 4, I applied to an officer candidate program that sounded like something meant for other people with family names that opened doors. The application asked for an essay on leadership. I wrote about the park bench in January, the cup of hot chocolate, and the sentence, "Sometimes God's greatest gifts come wrapped in our deepest pain." I wrote about a lawyer who told his daughter she was a disgrace to the family, and a girl who learned disgrace could become fuel. I wrote it all out, printed it at the library for 15 cents a page, and slid it into a manila envelope with hands that wouldn't stop trembling. The letter came in late spring. Sophia was coloring on the floor, a cartoon elephant on TV speaking in a voice that made my teeth ache. I opened the envelope and read the word accepted 3 times. It wasn't a movie moment. No orchestra swelled. I just sat there, knees pulled up, with that letter pressed to my chest while Sophia asked if we could have spaghetti for dinner. "We can have anything," I told her. And for once, it felt true. Training was a new kind of hard. I shipped out with a duffel bag and a promise to my daughter that I would return better. The days stacked up like building blocks. Reveille, chow, classes, field exercises, more chow, more studying, lights out, repeat. I learned to make my bunk with corners sharp enough to cut. I learned the language of maps, azimuth, contour line, resection. I learned how to count heartbeats in the quiet between orders. When a drill instructor barked at me for a mistake, I discovered that I could take the hit, fix the error, and not crumble. There were setbacks. During a ruck march in August, the sky cracked open and dumped water like judgment. My boots sloshed, my socks rubbed my heels raw. I thought about my father with every step, and it didn't hurt. It propelled me. A captain, sharp-eyed, steady, fell into step beside me without a word, then said quietly, "You've got more in you than you think." I carried that sentence like a medal. On weekends, I called home the home Sophia and I had made in our base housing. She told me about kindergarten, about a girl who wouldn't share the blue crayon, about a boy who ate glue and said it tasted like cookies. When she asked where I was, I said, "I'm learning to be strong," and she said, "Me too," in the voice of a child who believes strength is a color you can choose. By the time I commissioned, I was not the woman on the park bench anymore. I stood in a crisp uniform, my hair pinned back, a small bar on my chest that represented the hours and blisters and tears I'd paid. Sophia stood beside me in a yellow dress Margaret had found at a yard sale, clapping like the ceremony was just for her. In a way, it was. I sent my mother a copy of the commissioning photo with a short note. "I'm safe. We're okay." I didn't send one to my father. I wasn't ready to offer him any piece of my pride. Pride had been costly. I needed to keep it where I could see it. 2 days later, she returned to Fort Campbell to collect her belongings. The base looked different somehow, though nothing physical had changed. Perhaps it was the atmosphere, the way cadets moved with purpose rather than fear, or how the instructors gave clear directives without the undercurrent of intimidation that had once defined military training. There's something that happens when you survive the impossible long enough. The impossible becomes ordinary. I woke each day with a list and went to bed with a list for tomorrow. The posture became habit. The habit became identity. People started looking to me for answers. I learned to give them. And somewhere in the quiet hours between reveille and lights out, I felt a strange peace settle in the knowledge that the girl my father cast out had learned to command herself. I didn't know what would come next. I only knew this. I would never again be at the mercy of brick steps and a slammed door. I used to think healing would arrive like a trumpet blast, loud, unmistakable, a banner unfurled that said, "You made it." It didn't. It crept in sideways during ordinary mornings. Boots lined up at the door. Sophia spreading peanut butter on toast and singing the wrong words to take me home. Country roads, a stack of military manuals on the table with a grocery list tucked inside. Years have a way of sanding down the sharp edges. And the girl who once sat on a park bench in January became a woman who could brief a room full of colonels without her voice shaking. My first assignments were the kind nobody writes movies about: logistics, supply chain management, the boring backbone of readiness. But that was my lane and I ran it. I learned to move people and equipment like chess pieces, to see 3 problems ahead, to say no cleanly when a yes would break the system. I learned to stare down a whiteboard full of arrows and turn it into a plan. If there's one thing life had taught me since 18, it was that plans save lives. Sophia grew like a wildflower in concrete and somehow stayed beautiful. She was the kind of kid who collected library cards from every base we moved to and kept them like badges in a showbox. When she was 8, I found a crumpled note in her backpack from school. "Bring your dad to career day next Friday." It buckled me for a minute. I wrote the teacher and asked if I could come in uniform. The day I walked into that classroom, boots quiet on linoleum, heads turned and then turned back to their math worksheets. Sophia took my hand like it was the most normal thing in the world. "This is my mom," she said. No apology, no explanation. The note made it into the showbox too. If you're wondering about my parents, the answer is complicated. For years, there was nothing from my father but silence like a road washed out. My mother learned email at the public library and sent me notes about the weather and whether the hydrangeas had survived the frost. She never asked me for forgiveness. She just wrote like someone trying not to scare off a bird. I sent back pictures: Sophia in a Halloween costume from Goodwill, me in a muddy training field pointing at a map, a birthday cake with too many candles in base housing because a neighbor's daughter was turning 6 and her dad was deployed. Margaret, the woman with the casseroles, told me once that love, when it's been dented, sometimes looks like lawn chairs set side by side in silence. You sit, the other person sits. The sitting is the point. My sister Jessica sent a single Christmas card the year Sophia turned 12. It was one of those glossy ones with a staged family and matching sweaters at a tree farm. She wrote, "Hope you're well," on the back. No return address. I put it on the refrigerator and then took it down when it started to bother me. I don't know why I expected more from her. She'd spent our childhood collecting our father's approval like coins, counting them out for display. Some people never stopped doing that. I was promoted faster than I expected and slower than I wanted. That's the military for you. It's a clock you don't get to wind. The first time I pinned on Lieutenant Colonel, Sophia stood on her tiptoes to reach the insignia, her hands shaking. She pricked herself by accident and gasped. "It's good luck," I told her. And we both laughed because we needed to. Later, when everyone had gone and the sheet cake was just crumbs on paper plates, I sat on the floor of our empty quarters and stared at the uniform hanging on the closet door. It felt heavier than fabric. There were hard years too. I gave a piece of myself to the job that can't be measured on a resume. That's not unique to me. Anyone who's served knows the ledger never balances. But it's the kind of cost that doesn't have words you can write in a letter home: sleeplessness, the weight of decisions that ripple into other families' kitchens, the names you carry in your pocket like stones. If you're reading this as someone over 50, you know what it means to live a life and still feel 20 in one corner of your heart. The body keeps the ledger. So does the soul. By the time Sophia was finishing high school, she reminded me of a sailboat that had learned to find wind anywhere. She got a part-time job at the base library and came home with stories of retirees who shelved books by preference, not by Dewey Decimal, and of a widower who kept checking out the same Tom Clancy paperback like the ending might change if he asked nicely, some nights over meatloaf that refused to slice cleanly. She'd tilt her head and ask, "Do you ever want to go back to where home was?" I'd say what I always said. I built a new one, then I'd change the subject to her calculus test. It was around then that I learned to make peace with the quiet in my phone. My mother called sometimes, awkward and earnest. Once she told me she'd stood up in Bible study and said out loud that she had failed her daughter. Nobody said anything, she whispered. They just passed me the tissues. I didn't know how to hold that confession, so I set it down carefully between us and said, "Thank you." It was a small bridge to boards wide. It held. The day the promotion list came out, I didn't jump or cry. I stared at my name, Rebecca M., until the words blurred. A star is a strange thing. It's not a metal you can polish. It's a mirror that reflects back every person who helped you stand upright. Frank, with his napkin notes and blister advice. Margaret with casseroles. The captain who told me I had more in me than I thought. A teacher who gave me a C+ on a speech because she said my hands wouldn't stop shaking, and then stayed late to practice with me until they did. I told Sophia first. She screamed and then cried and then laughed because that's what big news does in a kitchen. With the promotion came a house I didn't expect to live in, brick and colonial, gated, more rooms than we needed. People think the military is all barracks and base housing. Sometimes it's a key handed to you with a stranger saying, "This is yours for now." Steward it well. I hired help because the job would swallow me if I didn't. A housekeeper twice a week and a man named Charles who managed the grounds and carried himself like a retired principal. He called everyone sir and ma'am, including the golden retriever next door that greeted him like a long-lost cousin. We didn't call him a groundskeeper. He called himself the keeper of details. He was the kind of man who trimmed hedges like he was tucking in a child for sleep. December rolled around and the world put on its holiday lights. We were planning a small reception, soldiers and spouses, a chaplain who told better stories than he preached, a few neighbors who knew to wipe their feet without being asked. The invitations were simple on purpose: cream cardstock, my name, a date, a time, a request to bring canned goods for the food bank downtown because the lines get longer when the nights get longer. I watched the stack of arvs grow in a silver bowl by the front door and felt the odd hum of contentment. Not pride exactly, more like steadiness. A week before the reception, my phone lit up with a number I hadn't saved but knew by heart. I let it ring once, twice, 3 times. On the 4th, I answered. Rebecca, my mother's voice. Smaller than I remembered. "Hi, Mom." There was a long inhale, the sound a person makes when the words are sharp and they want to soften them on the way out. "Your father, he's not well," she rushed on as if to outrun the rest. "He's still stubborn, but he listens to the doctor better than he ever listened to me." I said I was sorry because I was. Illness doesn't erase harm, but it makes everybody human again. She didn't ask for anything, not even to visit. She just said, "I've told him about Sophia. I've told him about you." The silence after that sentence felt like brick steps lighting up in another universe. "If you ever wanted to see us," she said, "we could come and not stay long. Your sister could drive." I pictured Jessica adjusting her rearview mirror in a car that smelled like dealership leather and judgment. I pictured my father gripping the armrest, righteous indignation running low like a battery. I told my mother I would think about it. Then I stood in my kitchen for a very long time, hands flat on the counter, and let 2 decades of anger and mercy circle each other like weary dogs. The truth is, I didn't know which version of myself would answer the door if they came. The one who sat on a park bench in January. The officer who could take a battlefield of moving parts and make sense of it. The daughter who still sometimes woke at 3 o'clock. A.m. with her heart pounding because a man once said a sentence that felt like a verdict. I made tea because that's what you do when there isn't a clear next step. I set out 2 cups and then put one back. I wrote a name on the guest list in small, careful letters. Guest of the general family. Then I crossed it out and rewrote it larger. Charles would need to know who to let through the gate. People imagine grand decisions happen on stages. More often they happen in kitchens with a pen that doesn't write smoothly. That night, I called Sophia, who was away at college, and told her grandmother might visit. "Do you want them here?" she asked, because she is old enough now to know that forgiveness offered to please other people curdles fast. I want a beginning, I said, surprising myself. We can always choose an ending later. She was quiet for a beat, then said, I'll be home for the reception. I can stand next to you, and just like that, the weight shifted a little. The next morning, I found a voicemail from my mother. Her voice was steadier this time. We'll drive down on Saturday, she said. We won't make a fuss. If you change your mind, just don't open the gate. It wasn't manipulation. It was mercy for both of us. Charles came into my office at the house with his clipboard. Ma'am, will you be expecting any special guests? He had a way of making special sound like a quilt someone had mended. I looked at his neat columns and my own name at the top and thought of that park bench and those brick steps. Yes, Charles, I said finally. Please add family. He clicked his pen, wrote carefully, and closed the clipboard like he was tucking in a story for the night. Very good, he said. We'll be ready at the gate. Saturday arrived like a held breath. The house was quieter than usual in the morning, a hush that felt almost ceremonial. I walked the perimeter at dawn, coffee cooling in my hand, checking the little things that people don't notice unless they're wrong. The wreath straight on the front door, the lights along the brick path, the flag at the right height and unfaded. Charles had arranged poinsettias in heavy ceramic pots and polished the brass on the gatehouse bell until it gleamed like a coin. House ready, he declared, and I nodded like a commanding officer inspecting a formation. I told myself I would work until they arrived. Emails, briefing notes, a schedule for the reception, anything to keep my hands busy. Instead, I found myself in the kitchen counting coffee cups as if the right number could steady my pulse. Sophia texted from the road. 30 minutes out. Picked up the cookies you like, I answered with a thumbs up and a heart emoji, then set down my phone because it felt suddenly heavy. By 11 o'clock, the winter sky had gone that high, pale blue that makes every sound carry. A squirrel chattered from the oaks. Somewhere, a lawnmower droned and stopped. I heard the gate intercom click in the kitchen. 2 beeps, the sound of Charles's line opening. Ma'am, his voice was low, as if we were in church. They've arrived. I didn't go to the window. I stood where I was and smoothed the front of my sweater as if it had creases I couldn't see. Habit had me check the time 11:17 and then check myself. Shoulders back, chin level, breathe from the diaphragm. It's funny the things that follow you from parade grounds into kitchens. I walked to the foyer and paused by the bowl of arvs. The stack had grown thick and festive names written in different hands. I picked one up at random, Chaplain Davis and Guest, and traced the loops of the capital D with my thumb. The doorbell rang. Not the front door, the gatehouse bell. Charles has a way of ringing it that is both courteous and insistent. 2 notes that say, "Attention please," without shouting. I stepped onto the front porch, the boards clean and sun-warmed. From there, I could see down the drive, the wrought iron gate open like parted theater curtains. Charles in his dark suit with clipboard under his arm, and beyond him a silver sedan idling with its blinker ticking. Another car waited behind it, rental by the day, the kind with the plastic tag hanging from the mirror. I took the brick steps slowly, hearing the crunch of my own footsteps on the gravel, and stopped by the dogwood where the shade held a pocket of cool. I didn't want to meet them halfway like a supplicant, or make them walk the full distance like petitioners. Somewhere in the middle felt right. Charles, precise even at a distance, lifted one hand in a small salute. I could tell he'd already done the mental algebra of tension and kindness, and chosen a setting that wouldn't break either. He opened the sedan's passenger door. My mother unfolded herself from the seat, careful with her purse and with her breath. She wore a wool coat I recognized from a life ago, navy with buttons that had belonged to my grandmother. Her hair was shorter, more silver, her mouth trying to be a smile. She looked past the yard and the winter bare trees and found me with the certainty of a mother who has always known where to look first. My sister got out on the driver's side, sunglasses too dark for the day, jaw set. She had aged into our father's profile. The ridge of the nose, the habit of standing with feet too far apart like a claim on the ground. She leaned on the door as if it could hold her up inside whatever story she'd brought with her. In the second car, a figure shifted in the back seat. My father then stopped, as if even that motion had taken something from him he didn't want to spend. He did not get out. Charles glanced at his clipboard and then at them, his courtesy like a shield. He gestured to the gatehouse window where a small brass plaque hung. "Visitors, please check in. Good morning," he said. "Are you here to see General Rebecca?" It was the softest question, delivered like a napkin placed under a glass, and it landed like a gavel. My mother's hand went to her throat. Jessica's sunglasses slipped lower on her nose as if gravity wanted her to truly see. In the back seat, my father's face turned toward the voice. The words hung in the winter air between them and the fence and the years. For a moment, nobody spoke. You don't realize how loud silence is until you're inside one that big. My mother recovered first. "Yes," she said, speaking not to the gate or the house or even to me in the distance, but to the universe that had finally rewritten a sentence she'd been afraid to say aloud. "We're here to see our daughter." Charles inclined his head. "Very good." He stepped back, courtesy clearing a path before anyone knew how to walk it. The gate, obedient to a switch he didn't seem to touch, swung wider. I moved down the drive, the wind lifting the edge of my scarf, and met them where the gravel meets pavement, up close. The years were more obvious on all of us, new lines around eyes, old pain living under the skin. My mother reached for me and then stopped herself, hands hovering like birds that weren't sure about the perch. I saved her the decision and stepped into her arms, the wool scratchy on my cheek. Her perfume still the same drugstore floral that could make a kitchen smell like spring in February. "I'm so sorry," she said into my shoulder. The words small and fierce and late and exactly on time. "I should have gone after you." I should have. She ran out of verbs. I held her tighter for the ones she couldn't find. Over her shoulder, my sister stood awkward and handsome and wrong-footed. "Rebecca," she said, the syllables tasting unfamiliar to her. She glanced back at the second car where our father sat, and for once, there was no smirk to borrow, no audience to play to. She looked like a girl who had lost her place in a script and didn't know how to admit it. "Jessica," I said. "It's remarkable how a name said without weight can set a ceiling on conflict." The back door opened slowly. My father swung his legs out, planted his feet carefully, and rose in small increments like a man accounting for each joint. He had thinned. The authority that used to walk into a room ahead of him no longer did the scouting. He was himself, and he was not. His eyes met mine the way a man might stare at a horizon that had moved on him when he wasn't looking. He came forward 3 steps and stopped. I saw the calculation, the old rulebook in his head with no entry for approaching a daughter you exiled, who now outranks every story you ever told about yourself. He opened his mouth and closed it. His hands, those hands that had pointed and preached and pounded the kitchen table, were empty. I spoke first because someone had to. "Thank you for coming," I said. The sentence tasted like clean water. No sugar, no poison, just true. My father's mouth worked around a reply. "General," he said, as if trying on a coat that didn't belong to him. Then quieter, "Rebecca." It wasn't apology. It was orientation. He had to locate me in the world before he could attempt contrition. Charles, who can read rooms like maps, offered my mother an arm. "Ma'am," he said, "there's coffee inside if you'd like to warm up." My mother's gratitude toward that sentence could have lit the wreath on its own. Jessica nodded at the gatehouse clipboard as if numbers could save her. My father looked from the house to me to the ground, landing nowhere long enough to stake a claim. We started up the drive together with the awkwardness of people who share a history but not a rhythm. The crunch of gravel underfoot kept time. Sophia's car turned and then cookies on the passenger seat. Her face bright in a way that made me feel 18 and ageless all at once. She parked, hopped out, and read the scene in a single glance the way children of complicated families learn to do. She walked straight to my mother and said, "Hi, Grandma. I'm Sophia." My mother's hand flew to her mouth and then to Sophia's cheek, as if verifying both existence and warmth. You're beautiful, she managed. You look just like, she stopped before saying me, because humility had found her at last. The winter sun had climbed enough to make the brick glow. A neighbor's wind chimes set a soft tinkling that didn't match any melody but made one anyway. We reached the porch. I held the door open, the wood heavy and familiar in my palm, and my family, careful, chastened, curious, stepped into a house they had imagined as a ruin and found as a refuge. Before I followed them in, I turned back and saw Charles standing at the gate, clipboard tucked against his ribs, proud and protective and perfectly still. He caught my eye and offered the smallest nod, the kind you give a fellow sentry at the end of a long watch. I returned it. Inside, the heat rose gently from the floor vents, carrying the smell of coffee and cookies and something like peace. The day had only begun, and already a sentence that had once been a verdict had been answered by a question at a gate. Are you here to see General Rebecca? Yes, they were. I didn't plan the afternoon to be a ceremony. It was just a small reception, the kind of thing that fills a house with coats on banisters and the sound of people finding each other in kitchens. But uniforms have a way of making an ordinary room into a witness. I went upstairs to change, not because I needed to prove anything, but because I wanted the truth visible. The jacket lay on the bed, pressed and dark, the silver star on my shoulder catching the winter light. Beside it, a small box with Margaret's pearls. I fastened them and thought about the casserole dishes she lined up on my counter that first year, and how mercy is sometimes baked in Pyrex. When I came down the stairs in dress uniform, conversation thinned the way it does when a hymn begins without anyone announcing it. The chaplain straightened. Sophia's eyebrows lifted in a private smile that said, "There she is." My mother's hand flew to her mouth, and tears sprang up the way they do when a person finally believes what they've been hoping might be true. Jessica stared at the insignia as if the geometry could explain the years between us. My father stood a beat longer than anyone else, chin tipping back, taking in the cut of the cloth, the ribbons he didn't recognize, the deliberate simplicity of a life measured in service and not in speeches. Lunches in the dining room, Charles announced, voice gentle as if he were narrating a truce. People drifted toward ham biscuits and deviled eggs and a punch bowl glinting like a friendly pond. The chaplain asked if he could say grace. We bowed our heads. In the quiet, I felt my mother's fingers brush the back of my hand like a question she didn't know how to ask. I turned my palm up and let her anchor there. After the amen, Frank shuffled in on his bad knee with a tin of cookies and a grin big enough to erase a storm. "Sarge," I said, and he saluted me with 2 fingers and a wink, because old Marines reserve the right to be irreverent. He clocked the star on my shoulder, looked pleased, and set his tin next to the store-bought cookies like coordinates on a map. "Brought the good ones," he said. "The kind sugar forgets to be sorry about." Neighbors came. A young lieutenant from down the street balanced a baby on one hip and a plate on the other. A sergeant major handed Sophia an envelope and said, "For the library fund. Tell them it's for large print mysteries," and I thought of her showbox full of cards. It felt for a few minutes like any December afternoon in a house that had learned the rhythm of that season. Coats off, stories on. The clatter of forks making a kind of music. Then someone rang the bell and the front door opened to a draft of cold air and a wall of white hats. Midshipmen from the Naval Academy's choir. In town for a concert, dropping off canned goods because the chaplain had asked. They filed in, cheeks pink, suddenly aware they had crashed a room full of brass. The senior midshipman stiffened when he recognized me, barked a crisp "ma'am" that ricocheted off the crown molding. The room paused. I lifted a hand in that small permissive wave that tells a young leader how to be both formal and human. "At ease," I said. "Put the cans by the pantry, then fix yourself a plate." My father watched them move past him like a river he had forgotten how to read. He glanced at Jessica as if to say, "See," and then at me as if to ask how. I couldn't give him the decades in a sentence. so I gave him a dinner roll from the tray and the possibility of a conversation. People lined up for food. I heard the chaplain telling my mother about the food bank downtown and how the line had doubled since the factory closed. She keeps it stocked, he said, tilting his head toward me. Nobody knows how because she doesn't let us brag on her. My mother pressed her lips together, that look she gets when gratitude is too big for her mouth. Jessica drifted close to the mantel, examined the photos like they might betray me. Field exercises in the rain. Sophia at a science fair with flour on her cheek. Me in a hard hat at a groundbreaking for a clinic. A grainy snapshot of the warehouse church with folding chairs and a crooked cross. So, she said finally, you really did all this. It wasn't admiration. It wasn't spite. It was inventory. I let the word yes be enough. My father picked up a deviled egg and put it back down. He cleared his throat and tried on the voice he used at church suppers. Well, he said too loudly, we all make mistakes. What matters is he paused, searching for a moral he could live with. We move on. The room heard him. Rooms always do. The chaplain's eyes softened. Frank set down a cookie. Sophia stilled. My mother's fingers tightened on my palm from a minute ago, though we were no longer touching. Old habits resurfaced in my father's face. Control, rewrite, absolve. I felt the past reach for me, and I didn't step into it. I set my plate on the sideboard and turned toward him. No, I said, not unkindly. We don't just move on. We tell the truth first. Silence rearranged itself. It wasn't the heavy, accusatory kind. It was the attentive kind, the way a congregation leans when a testimony is about to matter. The truth, I continued, is that you sent me out that night without a coat, and I learned to be warm by making a life that didn't require your permission. The truth is that Mom loved me in emails she typed with 2 fingers. The truth is that Jessica and I turned our backs on each other because it was easier than facing you. The truth is that hungry people eat better at the food bank in December, not because you preached about charity, but because this neighborhood shows up with paper bags and humility. My father's mouth opened. Nothing came. He looked down at his hands as if they might have the script written on them. When he lifted his head, the room had set itself around the reality he'd avoided. His daughter in a uniform he had not earned for her. Surrounded by a community he did not create. Standing on a floor he did not sweep. He had to choose whether to be small or to be honest. I was wrong, he said at last. The words shaped like stones but spoken like bread. I was cruel. I thought I was protecting something that didn't need protecting. Or maybe I was just protecting myself. He swallowed. I'm sorry. He did not cry. He did not collapse. He stood and told the truth, and that was its own kind of kneeling. My mother made a sound I had never heard. From her, relief and grief braided together, and took his hand. The chaplain cleared his throat. If it's all right, he said, I'd like to offer a word. He didn't wait for permission so much as ask the room to hold still. There are apologies that come out like PR, and there are apologies that come out like prayer. I heard the second one. He turned to me. General, would you allow an old preacher to embarrass you for a moment? He didn't wait for my answer either. Friends, this woman has funded our food bank for 3 winters and never let me put her name on a bulletin. She set up a scholarship in Margaret's name because casseroles kept a young mother alive. She sent kids to summer camp and bought textbooks for students who didn't own more than a dream. If you want a sermon, you're standing in one. I felt heat rise up my neck, that old discomfort of being named out loud. I shook my head slightly, but he wasn't wrong. Frank laughed, wiping his eye with a knuckle. Told you excellence starts with the details, he said to nobody in particular, across the room. One of the midshipmen, eager, earnest, put down his plate and, by instinct more than protocol, squared himself to me. Others followed, a ripple of spines straightening. The sergeant major set his coffee on the mantel. People who had never worn a uniform stepped back and quieted, not because anyone ordered them to, but because honor, when you witness it, rearranges your posture. Please don't, I murmured, because I am suspicious of spectacle. But the moment wasn't about me as much as it was about witness. My mother seeing her daughter honored for the very life she feared had destroyed her. My father seeing a room align itself not to punish him, but to tell the truth. He had finally spoken. I took a breath and let the silence crest and fall. I didn't come back to gloat, I said, voice steady, the line that had been waiting all afternoon. I came back to see if a family can change. Something in the room exhaled. A Christmas carol floated in from somewhere, some neighbor's speaker bleeding through the cold, and it felt exactly right. That the lyric I caught was "Let every heart prepare him room." I turned to my father. "I don't forget," I said, giving him the dignity of clarity. "But I can forgive." I looked at Jessica. That goes for sisters who didn't know how to be sisters yet. Her jaw worked, and for once she didn't argue with mercy. Sophia came to my side and slid her hand into mine, small and strong. "We have cookies," she said into the charged quiet. "Because my daughter knows when to land a plane." Laughter broke the tension in tidy pieces, safe to pick up. People moved again. Plates clinked. The midshipmen, mortified by their own reverence, attacked the deviled eggs. My mother touched the star on my shoulder the way you might touch a relic and whispered, "You look beautiful." My father nodded once, like a man taking off his hat in a sanctuary. The house returned to itself, but something inside it had been repaired. It wasn't triumph. It wasn't even justice exactly. It was alignment. A verdict had been answered by a life, and a life had left room for grace. After the plates were stacked and the last midshipman had bowed himself out with a "Thank you, ma'am," the house settled into that soft fatigue parties leave behind. Charles fed platters to the kitchen like a man moving chess pieces after checkmate. The chaplain hugged my mother and slipped out with a promise to send along a hymn list for Christmas Eve. Frank tapped his bad knee and said he'd see himself out before anyone could object. The sergeant major left the envelope for the library on the sideboard with a note that said, "For Sophia's readers, keep the stories moving." I walked my parents and Jessica into the smaller sitting room off the foyer. It's the quietest space in the house, no television, just books and a window that looks onto the dogwood. The winter sun had turned shy, hiding behind a bank of washed wool clouds. Steam drifted from the mugs. Charles set down peppermint tea for my mother, black coffee for my father, water for Jessica because she looked like a woman in a suit trying not to crumple. Sophia carried in a plate of cookies and left us with the unobtrusive grace of someone who knows families require privacy to change shape. My mother reached for my hand and didn't let go. "I said it in there," she whispered, "but I want to say it again where it can land." "I failed you." I shook my head, not to erase what she needed to confess, but because the word "failed" felt too simple for what fear does to a person inside a marriage built on rules. "You were afraid," I said. "I was too. The difference is I had to walk through it." Her fingers tightened. "I was raised to believe a woman's virtue is obedience," she said, voice steady. "I forgot that love sometimes contradicts bad doctrine." Jessica cleared her throat like she was about to propose emotion. "I should have called," she said. She looked at the floor when she said it, which told me she meant it. "I told myself you were better off without the noise." "Mostly I told myself what Dad told me." She glanced toward our father and then back at her hands. "That you made your choice." She shrugged. "A girl in a woman's jacket." "I made mine too. I chose easy." "I'm sorry." There was no nuance to offer her. I let the apology sit on the table between us like a gift and said, "Thank you." My father didn't speak for a long time. He held the coffee with both hands like a man warming himself by a barrel fire. When he finally looked up, the old pulpit cadence was gone. "I thought righteousness required severity," he said. "I thought I had to show you the cost of your sin." He closed his eyes once, an old man blinking away an old script. "Turns out I just showed you the cost of mine." He lifted his head. "I don't know how to fix what I broke." The sentence didn't tremble. It was sturdier that way. "You can't fix it," I said, not unkindly. "We can only tell the truth about it and then decide how to live from here." He nodded, absorbing limits like lessons. "I want to meet my granddaughter properly," he said. "If she'll let me." I could have made him work for that privilege, could have named a list of conditions as long as the years I'd spent earning my nights. But Mercy, when you hoard it, spoils. She already knows your name, I said. She knows the whole story. It belongs to her as much as it does to any of us. Sophia must have been listening in the hall because she appeared then. As if summoned by the word granddaughter, she sat across from my father. Posture open, the cautious kindness of someone raised to be brave. Hi, she said. I like the way Grandma describes the weather. She uses words like spitting and blustery. My mother laughed through her nose and pressed a napkin to the corner of one eye. My father tried on a smile that didn't quite know where to sit. I used to read the weather on the local radio, he said, surprising all of us. Your grandma would tell me if I'd said chance of showers too many times in a week. Sophia nodded as if cataloging this soft fact. You're welcome to read our weather anytime, she said. We need more words for snow. We talked like that for a while, not about the night on the brick steps or the years that followed or the ceremonies in base housing and the long ledger of absence, but about small, ordinary things. The price of eggs, the church potluck schedule, how the library prints free coloring pages on Fridays. It wasn't avoidance. It was scaffolding. Sometimes you have to build a conversation that can hold a heavier roof. When the light folded itself into late afternoon, my mother said they should go before the road's ice. She stood and hesitated, then did the bravest thing I saw her do all day. She took my father's hand and placed it in mine, a solemn, deliberate transfer of something I couldn't name. Please let us come for Christmas, she said. The words were simple and impossibly large. I didn't answer right away. Every instinct I had honed, the command voice, the triage, the capacity to move a room toward a decision, backed off and let something older speak. Yes, I said, but it will be on my terms. I looked at my father. No speeches, no rewriting. We're going to set one plate at a time and tell one true story at a time. His shoulders dropped, a soldier at ease. Understood, he said. At the door, Jessica paused. Do you remember that game we played in the backyard? The one with the chalk lines and the broomstick? Of course, I remembered. We were poor enough back then to make baseball out of whatever the garage surrendered. You always hit it over the fence, she said. I always said you cheated, she swallowed. You didn't. It was as close as she could get to I admired you. And maybe even I was scared of how strong you were. We shook hands like women who had just laid down their weapons. They drove away with their blinker ticking and their silence rearranged into something that might, with tending, become peace. Charles closed the gate and came back to the porch with the day's clipboard under his arm. All present and accounted for, he said. I laughed because he was not wrong, and because some sentences can be true and tender at once. That night, after the dishes, I stood on the back steps with a mug of tea and watched my breath appear and disappear like speech bubbles in a winter comic strip. Sophia joined me in a sweatshirt that had migrated from my drawer to hers. How do you feel? She asked. I was honest. Tired, I said. Lighter, she nudged me with her shoulder. I kept thinking, please don't let the story eat my mom. It didn't. You ate it. We stood there, letting the moon dilute the darkness. Before bed, I took out a box I hadn't opened in years. Inside, the ROTC acceptance letter, a library card from a base long closed, the first picture of me in a uniform that didn't quite fit, a snapshot of Sophia at 3 wearing a saucepan like a helmet. I added something new, today's guest list. Family, written in Charles's tidy hand. You keep records of Mercy the way you keep receipts for taxes, because someday you'll need to show the math. On Sunday, I called the food bank director and doubled our December delivery. I wrote a check to the warehouse church and asked Margaret's pastor to spend it on whatever smelled like grace in a kitchen. Then I sat at the dining room table and wrote 3 notes, one to my mother, one to Jessica, one to my father. I didn't write metaphors or sermons. I wrote logistics. Arrive at 3. Wear warm coats. Bring one story you're ready to tell true. Sophia sealed the envelopes with a flourish like a magician closing a trick. On Christmas Eve, my daughter would ring their doorbell with a gift. I hadn't decided yet if it would be a framed photo or a letter folded to fit a pocket, or simply an invitation to sit down without armor. I only knew it would be something a family could hold with both hands. I turned off the lights, the house ticking as it cooled, and stood a minute longer at the window. The dogwood branches were black lines against the sky. Somewhere far off, a siren wailed. Snow fell. I said a small prayer that sounded mostly like thank you and nada, little like help. Then I slept the kind of sleep you earn when you stop rehearsing a wound and start practicing a future Christmas. Eve arrived in a slow hush, as if the whole town had agreed to lower its voice. The sky was the color of pewter, and the air held that crisp metallic promise that snow might come if we were patient. I woke before the alarm, the way you do on the morning of a day you've been building toward for a long time. Downstairs, the tree lights glowed like small, stubborn stars. Charles had already set the coffee and lined the mantel with little brown paper bags for the food bank, each one labeled in his careful block letters. Beans, rice, pasta. Sophia patted in hair in a messy knot and handed me a mug without a word. We stood shoulder to shoulder, watching the living room fill itself with warmth. Are you ready? She asked. Her voice was gentle, seasonally appropriate. I don't know, I said, telling the truth. But I think we are. We spent the morning like 1,000 other families across this country, checking timers, bickering lightly over oven space, ironing a tablecloth that would wrinkle the minute the first plate was set. I pulled the ham from the oven and listened to it sigh. Sophia arranged oranges and cinnamon sticks in a bowl because she likes bowls to look like invitations. I set out the little nativity I've carried from base to base, the one with a chipped shepherd and a Mary whose staff is glued on crooked. It's not valuable, but it is ours. At noon, I called my mother. We're leaving in 20, she said. Her voice had the bright steadiness of someone who was rehearsing being brave. I thanked her for the warning and texted Charles. He replied with a thumbs up and a Santa emoji, which from him read like a salute. They arrived at 2:52 early by our family standards, which I decided to consider progress. I heard the gatehouse bell, then the crunch of tires on the drive, then the soft thud of car doors. I stepped onto the porch. My mother's scarf was festive enough to qualify as optimism. Jessica carried a pie like an apology with a lattice top. My father wore his good coat, the one that smelled faintly of cedar and old hymns. Come in, I said, and meant it. Inside, the house did its part. Heat lifted from the floor vents. The tree lights winked. Somewhere in the kitchen, cinnamon announced itself without asking permission. Sophia met them at the doorway with 3 small envelopes addressed in her patient, looping hand. For later, she said, passing them out. No peeking. We ate early because that's what families do when nerves pretend to be hunger. The ham sliced clean, as if it understood the assignment. My mother declared the green beans perfect and then admitted she liked them better when they were overcooked to a soft surrender. The way her mother made them, Jessica took seconds without comment, which I took as a compliment. My father chewed like a man concentrating on a test he had studied for. Finally, after we cleared plates, Sophia stood and cleared her throat with theatrical seriousness. All right, she said. House rules for story time. She held up a finger. 1. No speeches. A second finger. 2. No rewriting. A third. 3. Truth first, tenderness close behind. She looked at me. That's what you said, right? I smiled at the version of myself reflected back at me, trimmed and softened, but intact. We moved to the sitting room. The dogwood outside was the color of ink, and the first snowflakes began to drift past the glass like lazy confetti. Sophia handed out the envelopes. On the count of 3, she said. We opened them together. She counted, we tore, and 3 photographs slid into 3 laps. My commissioning day 20 years ago. Sophia small and determined beside me in her yellow yard sale dress. My hair pinned back, my smile tentative but real. My mother's hand went to her heart. Jessica sucked in a breath. My father, God help me. My father reached out with a fingertip and traced the outline of the silver bar on my shoulder in the picture, as if touch could travel time. I wish I had been there, he said. The sentence was not a request for absolution. It was an offering shaped like regret. You weren't, I said, because facts are scaffolding. But she was. I nodded at my mother, who had begun to cry the way some people pray quietly, repetitively, into a tissue that didn't stand a chance. I took her hand. You found words when you could. That counts. We took turns. Jessica told a story about the chalk-lined baseball game we'd remembered. At the door the day she accused me of cheating, because I kept hitting the ball over the fence to where the neighbor's dog would hide it like treasure. You weren't cheating, she said again, this time with a grin that let the girl out of the woman. You were just better. She looked at Sophia. Don't tell your mother I said that. My mother told a story I had never heard. How the night I left, she stood in our dark kitchen and pressed her palm to the window over the sink, feeling for my shadow in the yard. I wanted to run after you, she said, voice steady, eyes on the past. I wanted to pick you up and carry you back like a girl who'd fallen off her bike. I didn't because I thought it was godly to stand by my husband. I was wrong about what God required of me. She squeezed my fingers. I am trying to be braver now. My father stared at his hands for a long moment, then lifted his head. I used to think forgiveness was a thing a pastor dispensed out a window like drive-through grace, he said, the ghost of his old cadence softened by new weather. Tonight I understand it's a table you set every day. It's plates and forks and an honest sentence. He let out a breath. I won't ask you for what I don't deserve, but if you will show me where the plates go, I will set the table. I stood and fetched the plates. He followed me into the kitchen, shoulders squared as if reportable action helped. We set out china together, side by side, like people laying a small daily foundation. He placed the forks opposite from where I would have put them, and I left them there. Because sometimes forgiveness looks like letting a fork be wrong for an evening. Back in the sitting room, the snow had decided to commit. The flakes thickened, and the street outside went quiet in that way that makes even grown men look out the window like boys. The doorbell rang. Sophia looked at me and arched an eyebrow. Right on time, she said. She ran to the foyer and opened the door to the cold. A gust of air and a flurry of white followed her back as she carried in a long, narrow box wrapped in brown paper and tied with twine. A simple label in her hand. For Grandma and Grandpa. My mother's hands trembled as she untied the bow. Inside, nested in tissue, lay a framed photo collage, 3 pictures side by side. On the left, a grainy print of me at 18 on that park bench, belly round beneath a too thin coat, face set against the world. In the middle, my commissioning day, the picture they had just held, resized and brightened, Sophia's dress yellower, my smile braver. On the right, a recent photo from our reception last week, me in uniform, star bright, my mother's fingers on my sleeve, my father's head bowed a fraction in the kind of respect that doesn't need a microphone. Below the photos, Sophia had lettered a sentence in ink that bled a little at the curves. Family isn't who never breaks your heart. It's who shows up with glue. My mother made a sound I will carry into old age. My father cleared his throat and then gave up the pretense of composure. Jessica looked at the ceiling, blinking hard. As if the plaster might explain grace, Sophia stood between them, hands folded the way she did when she was little and wanted to be careful with the world. Thank you, my mother whispered, touching the glass where my 18-year-old face stared back at us with her chin up. Thank you for not throwing me away when I didn't know how to hold you. My father reached for the frame, then stopped himself, waiting to be invited. I nodded. He took it in both hands like a sacrament. We hung the collage in the hallway where people can't miss it on their way to the bathroom. That's strategic, Sophia said, satisfied. Everybody visits the truth eventually. We laughed not because the line was funny, though it was, but because laughter is how relief exits the body when it has been waiting too long. We sang carols after that badly, earnestly. My father's baritone was rusty but true. My mother found the alto harmony she had abandoned years ago and slipped back into it like a favorite sweater. Jessica and Sophia took turns butchering the descant on O Holy Night, which felt appropriate. Some things are supposed to be a little out of reach. We lit candles and carried them to the porch, watched the snow settle on their paper collars, and listened to our town grow muffled and holy. Before they left, my father paused at the door, hat in hand. "I don't deserve this," he said, gesturing to the warmth behind us, the table we'd set. The picture on the wall that told the truth without cruelty. I put my hand on the door jamb the way a woman might touch a mezuzah and said, "None of us does." That's why it's called Christmas. On the porch, we exchanged the hugs of people who have decided to try again. Their taillights disappeared into a white so soft it felt like permission. Charles closed the gate and returned to the house, snow on his shoulders. He tapped his clipboard. "Ma'am," he said, "shall I note that reconciliation is in progress?" I laughed. "Yes," I said, "but put it in pencil. We'll update as we go." Later, when the house was quiet and the tree hummed, Sophia handed me a last envelope with my name on it. Inside was a photo of her at 6, wearing a saucepan like a helmet and saluting me with a wooden spoon. On the back she had written, "Mom, you taught me that strength is making room for someone after they used up their last chance. Merry Christmas." I pressed the picture to my chest the way I had pressed that acceptance letter years ago, and thought about how love is a ledger that doesn't balance on paper but somehow does in the heart if you've listened this far. Especially if you're old enough to have a box of your own pictures that smell faintly of time. I hope you'll do something simple and hard. Call the person you've been rehearsing an argument with and try rehearsing a welcome instead. Share this story with someone who needs a reason to set one more plate. And if our time together meant something, I'd be honored if you'd subscribe to Beyond Family Secrets and stay. There are more tables to set, more truths to tell, and more ways to choose each other, one ordinary day at a time.